Hello, everybody, and welcome to Revolution. Jay Baker here. It is August 3rd. I didn't think July was ever going to end, but looks like we finally made it through July. T-shirt feeling a little tight. It's been a life is still crazy. It's hard to even just comment on anything that's happening in the world right now because it's just this constant. Oh gosh, let me make sure my volume is up on my mic. All right, there we go. It's just a constant craziness that's happening in this world right now. Everything that's happening is a lot, and we all seem still very divided. It's a lot, but today we are going to finish up our Paul Tillich, Shaking the Foundations. It always makes for a good ad. And You Are Accepted by Paul Tillich. So I'm excited about that. So every now and then almost every time before I do a talk, I'm always, oh, you know what? Hold on one second, everybody. Almost forgot. There it is. Forgive me, everybody. Sorry about that. We're going to have to do a little start over again. My goodness. Quite crazy. All right. Well, let's just start that over again. One more time, shall we? Oh, I'll get this down soon. New computer, new microphone, everything. So we're going to start from the top, everybody. 1, 2, 3. Welcome to Revolution, everybody. Like I said, life has been a little bit crazy lately. So much horrific stuff is happening in the world. And it's wild to watch and try to understand why certain people defend bad things. And I wish I could understand that more. And I try to have those tough conversations, but it's not always easy. Because I don't feel like I can be quiet about suffering. I can't be quiet about what's happening in Gaza. I can't be quiet about what's happening with our immigrant brothers and sisters. And I guess that leads to more conversations. So that could be somewhat positive. So today we are going to be finishing up on Paul Tillich's You Are Accepted from the book Shaking the Foundations. Great book. I love this book. This is going to be the best part of the book. So hurrah, you came at the right time. And but I wanted to talk to you about something I was thinking about last night. It was weird because I was online. Shocker. Jay was online. I can't even believe it. And someone was saying, questioning the Apostle Paul. I put something up on it on my Instagram. So if you want to see that, it's on my Instagram stories today. And I commented to the people like, more of that concept of like, we've got to get rid of Paul, or Paul's not really get rid of Paul, but Paul's message isn't, we're following Paul, not Jesus, that kind of thing. And I've always struggled when people put Jesus and Paul against each other. It doesn't really work for me because I didn't really understand what grace was. I mean, I can say the earliest things I read in the Bible for myself were the Gospels, and I still thought God hated me. And it wasn't until I really read the Apostle Paul that I started to understand the concept of grace. So that was a big one. But yeah, so this guy wrote this. So I wrote something because a friend of mine shared it. And I was like, hey, we can't get rid of Paul. I think that's bad theology. I think it's dangerous theology. Anytime I see people who have kind of kicked Paul out, it's almost as though they forget how to love their neighbor and forget how to show grace and things like that. And I said, yeah, there's some issues with Paul, even genuine Paul. There's issues. I mean, we're talking about a Middle Eastern man 2,000 years ago. But, even when I was a part of the Red Letter Christians, I was one of the first people at the Red Letter Christian meeting. And even then I thought, well, I'm such a Paul guy. It's hard to be at something where they're like, well, if we just read the red letters, everything will be fine. Anyway, maybe I'll repost something about it so you guys can find it. It's worth a look. But I was having that conversation, and the person was kind of, one of the arguments was, this is why people leave the church, is because, Paul's theology and that kind of thing. And so I was laying in bed and trying to sleep, and my mind races at night, just constantly. It's very hard for me to sleep. I usually don't fall asleep for about 2 hours. And it hit me like, the reason I had such a hard time with Christianity growing up is that I thought all the angry, judgmental Christians were the real Christians. That's what I thought. I thought all the Assemblies of God Christians, all the Baptist, all these people were Christians. And the dilemma that came to me was that, well, this must be what God's like. And so I didn't want to have anything to do with God. I didn't want to have anything to do with Christianity. But I still believed it. So that was the interesting thing, So me, it was like, well, hopefully I'll have this kind of like deathbed experience, and make things right at the end, because, I can't live this way. And I blamed God for that. I was like, God must have made a mistake because I can't live up to the way how these Christians act and talk and things like that. I can't figure out how they do it. And I also thought the loving ones and the graceful ones and the ones who talked about grace were condoning their own sin. I thought, oh, they just like to do bad things. They just like to have fun with their sin. I mean, it was a very teenage way of thinking about it. I was, late teens, early 20s. And it really took understanding who the Apostle Paul was and realizing like, oh my God, everything I was raised in, all these people have missed it. And it's like, I continue to have that revealed to me over my lifetime now. And I think a hard thing for that is to be like, I think one of the hard things for that is like, being amongst other Christians and hearing them say stuff like, well, maybe we should get rid of Paul, or maybe Paul's the problem, or, this, even like, and that's pretty progressive way of thinking. But for me, I'm like going like, that's not progressive at all. Like, you're not going to be, it was Paul that included the Gentiles. I mean, remember how Jesus was with the female Gentile, and she had to say, even dogs get crumbs from the tables. I mean, it's Paul who builds on that. It's the Apostle Paul who never mentions the word hell at all in any of its three meanings. It's Paul that reminds me that I can't be too good to restore someone. And I think Paul really understood the essence of Christianity. And it was Paul that made me realize that all the conservative Christians I grew up around didn't have a hold on the truth. So, I will continue to push Paul and think, if we truly want to be radically inclusive and continue to build on that work of the inclusiveness of Christ, but then Paul kind of building on that structure, that we have to build on the structure that Paul built as well. We can't just take that part of the foundation out, or we can't just be like, well, we'll just knock that building down and we'll just use this. And Paul is hard to understand because someone was like, what about in the book of Acts when Paul strikes that person dead? And I'm like, well, the book of Acts wasn't written by Paul. It was written about Paul. And it's not I don't think it's very accurate about the life of Paul. I mean, his conversion story gets told 3 different ways. It gets told 3 times in 3 completely different ways. I think it's interesting when you take away that story of the book of Acts. And I think it's interesting when you take away the false Paul, the pastoral epistles and some of the book parts in Corinthians that were added much later after his death. And then you get to see the real Paul. And I think that's why biblical scholarship is vitally important, understanding things like that. Even if you do deep study, you go like, well, Paul may have not actually been killing Christians. He may have been more of someone who was very harsh and very judgmental on them. But the book of Acts may have used some liberties to make Paul even worse than he actually was. Not that I'm defending it either way, because both ways it's amazing grace. But those are things worth looking at and studying and understanding. The problem is most people don't want to understand it. And ironically, it's usually most people who've dedicated their whole life to it. And often people who tell me I need to get right with Jesus or that there's something wrong with me or things like that. So it's tough, it is tough. So I having problems with my insurance again, and I did not take my blood pressure pills because I'm out. And I hope that it's okay, because I don't think my insurance stuff's going to get worked out till next week. And I'm a little worried about that. Anyhow, don't know why I just said all that to you, but I guess I needed to just get it out there and say I'm a little worried about that. So we're back and shaking the foundations. Paul Tillich. Paul Tillich was a German, and he also became an American immigrant. And the reason he was an immigrant was because he was kicked out of Germany by the Nazi Party. And they did not like his work and not like what he said. And had Paul Tillich not been kicked out and forced to leave, or had he not left, he would have been killed. It was very hard on Tillich because in the First World War, he did ministry work. He was I can't remember, what do you call the pastors who work with soldiers? And he also had medical training. But he did that in the First World War with the German army. And so he was really torn up by his excommunication from his own country. And he became an American teacher and philosopher, taught himself English, took a while, but, and here we have Paul Tillich. So I think it's important to remember, what do immigrants add? Paul Tillich is one. So we're going to jump in. We're almost through. We don't have very, very far to go, but I think we'll have a lot of comments to find here on what Tillich has to say. I'm going to I think this is where we finished off, and let me just double check. Yeah. I'll start a little bit where we left off, and then we'll jump into the new part. I'll start where he talks about the abyss. The abyss of separation is not always visible, but it has become more visible to our generation than to the preceding generations because of our feelings of meaninglessness, emptiness, doubt, and cynicism, all expressions of despair. I mean, think about how cynical we've all become, so much cynicism. People become so cynical that for me, half the time, I don't know if I'm arguing with somebody on the right or the left or what we're talking about, because there's oftentimes the main thing that runs through it is just this total type of cynicism. But it has become more visible this generation and preceding generations because of the feelings of meaninglessness, emptiness, doubt, and cynicism, all expressions of despair, of our separation from the roots and the meanings of our life. Sin in its most profound sense, sin as despair, abounds amongst us. And remember, this whole talk is based off of the verse from, I believe it's Romans, Yeah, Romans 5:20, where it says, moreover, the law entered that the offense might abound, but where sins abound, grace did abound much more. When sins abound, grace did much more abound, says Paul in the same letter in which he describes the unimaginable power of separation and self-destruction within society and the individual soul. He does not say that these words, because their sentimental interest, demand a happy ending for everything tragic. He says them because they describe the most overwhelming, determining experiences of his life. And a picture of Jesus as the Christ, which appeals to him at the moment of his greatest separation from other men, from himself and from God. He found himself accepted in spite of his being rejected. And when he found that he was accepted, he was able to accept himself and to reconcile to others. The moment in which grace struck him and overwhelmed him, he was reunited with that which he belonged and from which he was estranged in utter strangeness. I love that, estranged in utter strangeness. I mean, there's so much to unpack there. But I keep thinking about all these people who we always want to have an asterisk by grace. We want to have an asterisk by acceptance. We're so caught up in binary thinking. I had written something earlier, I posted something earlier today about, it shouldn't be controversial to want to feed hungry children and things like that. And then, people started, coming in. It shouldn't be controversial that the hostages need to be returned, and that and it's Hamas, and all this stuff of just they can't hold the dialectic of, well, maybe both sides are in the wrong here. They can't see that. Like, they've just been forced to think in a very dialectical black and white way of thinking of who's accepted and who's not accepted. And here Paul, in this moment of persecuting Christians, of being very judgmental, Christ reaches out to him. I mean, it reminds me of the story of Matthew, where Matthew's in the midst of tax collecting, yet Jesus says, "Come, be my disciple." Chaplain, yes, it's a chaplain Paul Tillich was a chaplain in World War I. I believe that was the case. Do we know what it means to be struck by grace? It does not mean that we suddenly believe. Now, this is, you got to listen to. Turn your ears on. Open up the heart. All right. Did you do that? Did you turn your ears on? Open your heart. Let a little bit of the bats in the darkness get out there. Some of the stinky smells. Do we know what it means to be struck by grace? God, I know what it means. And I'll tell you what, it's never ending. It is never ending, especially for me, because I know a lot of people think I'm a one-trick pony and all I do is talk about grace. But when you're really struck by grace, when you've really been denied it your whole life, and you've really thought that the creator of everything, that the ground of being was against you and that you were a mistake of it, when grace hits, when you've seen so much, grace hit me so hard to the point that I almost don't feel comfortable ever being in a church ever again. Like, I don't think I ever want to walk into a church building ever again. I don't even necessarily think I would want to be in a group of Christians. I'm just going to be real honest here, because I worry that we've missed it so much. We've gotten so far away from grace. And all I want to do is bring it. And it doesn't matter if it's a conservative church or a liberal church or an open and affirming church. I see in ways where we always distrust grace, where we always distrust this total acceptance, where there's always that it's either too good to be true, or that there's got to be a loophole to it, or there's got to be, another shoe is going to drop, something. People are always, something is always not quite there. And sometimes I feel that it's almost my life of doing revolution myself and not attending churches and not doing that type of things, reading more philosophy and psychology and things like that, that has allowed me to even embrace grace more and see it clearly. And unfortunately, often I can be a thorn in people's flesh or a fly in the ointment with folks just in any type of Christian following Christ setting of Christianity, is because I constantly want to remind them of grace and that there's something amazing there and there's something that's good news there. So that's what it meant for me to be struck by grace. But this is even better. I mean, Tillich really nails it here. I mean, really nails it. You got to listen to Pete Rollins read this. It's on our YouTube channel. It's on our Twitter. It's on our Apple channel. You got to listen to it because this is where he nails it though. So just remember that, make a little note when all of a sudden he goes, do you know what it means to be struck by grace? It does not mean that we suddenly believe that God exists or that Jesus is the Savior. I'm going to say that again because I can tell you there's a lot of people who I know would be very uncomfortable with that. I know a lot of you who are here today would not be uncomfortable with that, but I know there's a lot of people who grew up in the church. It's strange to me. I've had arguments before with atheists, and they would argue against this as well sometimes. But what I realize is a lot of my atheist friends who feel that they need to argue with me feel the need to use apologetics rather than biblical scholarship, because apologetics boosts up how shitty Christianity can be in a lot of ways. But biblical scholarship does something different and opens up it in a new way. I mean, I remember when I first found out that the pastoral epistles were not Paul, I was just like, oh, this is really good news, because I was really struggling with those. And that certain things in Corinthians weren't Paul. And it was the things that I thought were just like, God, what a jerk, not that he's not still a jerk in some places, but there were just some things where I was like, whoa. And what's so great about this freedom of where, is like, Tillich also, very famous quote is, doubt is not the opposite faith. It is merely an element of faith that really allowed Martin Luther King to understand his own faith and deal with his own wrestling with doubt and almost embrace it rather than wrestle with it. So it's really a beautiful thing. So for me, it also allows me to embrace my doubt and not worry so much about like the theological things I was raised to believe, like I'm not really concerned with the afterlife. I'm not really thinking about that. It's allowed me to live the here and now a lot more and live within the present. As I get older, I may worry about that. I've noticed that the few times I've had conversations with my father, he's thinking about it because he's 85. But at this point, I'm thinking about living life on life's terms and how we can be better for one another. But, but it's just this, there's such a freedom within grace, and that's why it's anarchy. That's why it will shake you to your core. Do we know what it means to be struck by grace? It does not mean that we suddenly believe that God exists. Could you imagine sitting in a chapel and probably 1948, maybe 1950, listening to this German theologian, one of the most brilliant men of the 20th century, as far as it goes, philosophy and theology. And all of a sudden he's telling you, oh yeah, and imagine if you're like an evangelical who's like, well, I just ended up going to United Seminary instead of, the Assemblies of God. And you're hearing this and you're going like, what is going on? Do we know what it means to be struck by grace? It does not mean that we suddenly believe that God exists or that Jesus is the Savior or that the Bible contains the truth. And if you wonder why I talk so much about grace, that's why. If you wonder why I go like, well, I'm not really concerned about winning people to Jesus. I want people to understand grace. I want them to realize they're accepted and help them to realize others are accepted. And I think those other things that were just mentioned do work themselves out in a lot of ways that we don't understand. To believe that something is almost contrary to the meaning of grace. Did you hear that? To believe that something is almost contrary to the meaning of grace. Furthermore, grace does not mean simply that we are making progress in our moral self-control in our fight against special faults, and in our relationships to men and women and to society. Um, Moral progress may be a fruit of grace, but it is not grace itself. And it can even prevent us from receiving grace. Now, listen to that. Moral progress may be a fruit of grace, but it is not grace itself. And it even prevent us from recognizing grace or from receiving grace. And he's going to get into that for a second. But what I want to say about that is how many times in church where, I grew up in the Assemblies of God, so altar calls were a big deal. Every head bowed, every eye closed. Yes, I see that hand. Yes, I see that hand. And then they would have you get up and stand up front. Be like, if you don't deny God, if you deny me in front of man, I will. It's like a bait and switch thing, and you get saved and you walk up front. And what I saw on a lot of these worlds was this immediate need to press moral law onto the person and to let this person know, now you have to accept these moralities. It's as though someone walked up to you and said, I have a free car for you. It's free. And they hand it to you and you get it. And they're like, now all I need you to do is accept the fact that you have to pay for the insurance. You have to pay the monthly bill and keep it filled with gas and have, oil changes every 3 months. It was like this, but I thought it was free. Well, it's free that I handed it to you, but now I've got to tell you everything you have to do with it. It was, it's not grace. And so that's where the legalism comes into it, because it's almost right off the bat, it's about morality. And a very particular type of morality based on what denomination or theology you go into. But usually there's some simple things that are usually covered by that. And it becomes so much about morality that it almost ignores morality. Like it becomes blind to actual morality. It doesn't allow grace to take place. It really just takes grace and shoves it to the side. It almost just uses the word grace to manipulate you to get to that point, and then it does the bait and switch. And we see that a lot in the church today. And I would even say, as far as you often sometimes see that even in the social justice, more liberal churches of like, okay, now you're going to, rather than you're going to give all this stuff up and not do all this stuff, they're like, now you've got to go do all this stuff, and you've got to become Mother Teresa if you really care about people, because, it's not cheap grace, and they'll go down that ways too. And so it often becomes this like self-help manual right overnight. And, so weird, right? Don't forget to like and subscribe. Always, every time I think of my son Milo, I think, don't forget to like and subscribe. He always tells me to tell you guys that. He wants me to have a contest of some sort. He thinks it's going to get us a lot more followers if we have a contest. So maybe we'll have a contest one day. Do you get what I'm saying? Do you follow? Can I get an amen? Furthermore, grace does not mean simply that we are making progress in our moral self-control, in our fight against special faults, in our relationships to people and to society. Moral progress may be a fruit of grace, but it is not grace itself, and it can even prevent us from receiving grace, as that's what I was trying to explain to you just a minute ago. Because for me, I did not receive grace. I just received condemnation constantly every time I sinned, every time I drank something, because I also had sins cut up in those individual things. And remember earlier when we were reading this book, he says, there's not individual sins. Sin is separation and grace is reunion. And so every time I would do one of these things, I would think, in the Assemblies of God, you could lose your salvation. It was like holding sand in your hand. So it was this constant, like, moral progress for me was like 1 step forward, 8 steps back. For there is too often a graceless, listen to this. This is what I was talking about, as Tillich says here. For there is too often a graceless acceptance of Christ, of Christian doctrine, and a graceless battle against the structures of evil in our personalities. So here's Tillich's nailing this in 1948. This is what we see in the church. This is why we see people leaving the church. There's those graceless battles. When we see people fall, we see gracelessness. When we see even progressives become progressive, sometimes they change from evangelicals to progressives and things like that. And even they can be very graceless in the way when they see people make mistakes or people fall, and then and they just jump in on it, and everybody jumps in and judges. I watched my parents be judged by both sides and mocked, relentlessly mocked and made fun of by both sides, including non-believers, including no Christians at all. But everybody seemed to come together and think, well, we can mock these people, we can dance on their graves. And that's kind of that graceless acceptance of Christian doctrine. That was, some of my atheist friends have that graceless acceptance of Christian doctrine that they don't believe in. And that's what they're arguing against. But I'm also have to tell them, like, oh, I don't believe in that graceless acceptance either. Then they go, well, maybe you're not really a Christian. That's what I've had them told me. Like, I had one guy who wanted to debate me that I wasn't really a Christian, an atheist telling me I wasn't a Christian because I was, I guess, too nice.